Arratsaldeon guztioi, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Good afternoon, everybody. La sesión de hoy, bueno, muchísimas gracias por seguir conectados al curso sobre la apartheid en Palestina y la criminalización de la solidaridad. Un miércoles más tiene mérito, bueno, pues volver a estar aquí en el mismo horario pues para una nueva sesión. Voy a dar, como esta sesión es un poquito distinta, voy a dar las pautas tanto de esta como de la próxima ahora al principio, porque luego únicamente tendremos la visualización del vídeo del ponente de hoy. Y mientras lo visualizamos, sí que si quieren hacer preguntas o que les transmitamos cualquier comentario, bueno, nosotros, tanto David como yo, recogeremos los distintos comentarios y se los haremos llegar a Michael, pero claro, como ya anuncié, pues Michael no puede estar conectado ahora mismo por la diferencia, no solamente por la diferencia horaria, sino por sus, digamos, pues las tareas y las labores que tiene que realizar en la universidad en estos momentos en Canadá. Por tanto, en ese sentido es un poco diferente. Cuando terminemos el vídeo, bueno, pues ya nos conectaremos la próxima semana, o sea, ya no tendremos la despedida. Sí que quería dejar claro, antes de pasar a presentar a Michael, que el chat sigue abierto, que se puede escribir. Yo también intentaré mandar algunos links a través del chat de los informes que el propio Michael, bueno, pues hace alusión en la ponencia y también advertir que los links los voy a poner a los informes en castellano, pero esos informes están en las 6 lenguas oficiales de la ONU que incluyen, pues, por supuesto, pues el inglés y también el árabe, si a alguien le interesa consultarlos en otro idioma. La próxima sesión es el miércoles que viene y ahí tendremos a Alice Samson-Estapé, que es la coordinadora europea del movimiento de BDS. Y sin más, salvo que David quieras añadir alguna cosa, pasaría a presentar a Michael, que es el ponente de esta tarde, del que tenemos el vídeo grabado. El profesor, lo voy a presentar en español porque toda esta información está en la página web de la ONU, o sea que se puede consultar en inglés. Si alguien quiere algo de más de información, puede acudir tranquilamente a la página oficial de las Naciones Unidas. El profesor Michael Lynk es el Relator Especial de la ONU para la situación de los derechos humanos en los territorios ocupados de Palestina, puesto para el que fue nombrado en 2016. Además, Michael Lynk es profesor de Derecho en la Western University de Ontario, en Canadá, donde imparte clases de Derecho del Trabajo, de Derecho Constitucional y Derechos Humanos. Antes de convertirse en académico, fue abogado laboralista, especializado en refugio y asilo, y también trabajó para Naciones Unidas, destinado en Jerusalén, precisamente. Como académico tiene una extensa labor investigadora en Derecho del Trabajo y Derechos Humanos y posee varias publicaciones científicas sobre la aplicación del derecho internacional en los conflictos de Oriente Medio. I would like to thank Professor Michael Lynk for recording this conference, especially for our course. For me, it's a pleasure to have him among the speakers of this course, and I repeat that I thank you a lot the technological effort to recording this conference. Thank you very much. Pedro, si podemos poner ya el vídeo.
Thank you to Dr. Tuchero and the Public University of Naverne for the generous invitation to speak to you today about my mandate as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. I plan to address 3 issues today that relate both to my mandate and to the core issues of international law that apply to the 53-year-old Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. First, I want to speak about my UN mandate as Special Rapporteur and what it involves. Next, I will speak about the key issues, both legal and political, that are at the center of the occupation. And third, I will address the issues of annexation and apartheid that have been used to describe the entrenched Israeli occupation. So the first item I want to speak about is my mandate as Special Rapporteur. Keep in mind that the promotion and protection of human rights is a core purpose of the United Nations. In the Charter of the United Nations, there are more than a dozen references to human rights, including in the preamble of the Charter, which states that the very purpose of the UN is to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. There are a number of bodies that make up the United Nations Human Rights Protection System. I will mention 3. First, there is the UN Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and is made up of 47 states who serve for 6-year terms on the Council. Think of the Council as the legislative arm of the UN human rights system. The Council passes resolutions, it commissions and receives reports, it investigates serious human rights situations, and it appoints special rapporteurs for specific human rights mandates. Spain is presently a member of the Council. Next, there is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the administrative arm of the UN human rights system. It is also based in Geneva. It supports the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it employs around 1,300 UN civil servants, both in Geneva and in field offices around the world. It conducts research, it issues reports, and it advocates on pressing human rights concerns. The current High Commissioner for Human Rights is Madame Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. She is a principal voice of the United Nations on human rights issues. And third, there are what is called UN special procedures, which are the special rapporteurs appointed by the Human Rights Council. These special rapporteurs are independent human rights experts who are appointed for 6-year terms to a specific mandate. There are approximately 55 or so special rapporteurs. Most of them have a global thematic mandate, such as a special rapporteur for food security or for housing or on extreme poverty or torture. Approximately 12 of the special rapporteurs are assigned a country mandate, such as a special rapporteur for human rights in North Korea or Myanmar or Cambodia, or in my case, Palestine. We special rapporteurs are not paid for our work, and we are not UN staff members. We are independent of governments and interest groups. Many of us are full-time university professors because that background provides us with the necessary expertise for our mandate, and it also allows us to be able to devote the 3 months or so every year to the work of our UN mandate while keeping our academic positions. As a special rapporteur for human rights in Palestine, I meet regularly with human rights groups, with governments, and with UN agencies. I issue 2 formal reports every year to the United Nations, where I choose a special theme related to the pattern of human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory. I deliver these reports in person to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the UN General Assembly in New York. I also regularly issue public statements seeking to alert the international community to alarming human rights trends on the ground in Palestine. I was appointed by the Human Rights Council in March 2016, so I am more than 4 years into my 6-year mandate. I travel regularly to Europe and the Middle East and New York to meet with governments and with human rights defenders. However, I am not allowed to visit the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel will not grant me permission to travel there because it has refused to recognize my mandate. I am often asked about my work and whether I find it uplifting or depressing. Overwhelmingly, I enjoy the work of the mandate, and I consider myself honored to be part of such an important human rights work and to have a role within the United Nations human rights system in all of this. It has its tough moments, but whatever criticism comes my way, is mostly by those who ardently defend the Israeli occupation and who do not accept the body of human rights and humanitarian law that applies to the occupation. When I was first appointed, one of my predecessors gave me wonderful advice, which I have always kept in mind. He said I have to honor two principles. First, I have to be fearless, which means being brave and truthful in my advocacy. I should expect criticism for my statements and my human rights perspective by those who defend Israel's occupation. Indeed, if I'm not being criticized, I'm probably not doing my work. And secondly, I should be responsible. That is, I should be sure of my facts. I have to be solid in the law that I rely upon, and I should be dispassionate in my analysis. Credibility and reliability are indispensable values in this work, so I work hard to find the right tone and the credible facts to advance my criticisms of human rights violations that I come across. Now let me turn to the second topic of this presentation, which goes to the key issues in the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. I want to provide you with 7 key features of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that are essential to understand why a 20th century problem dealing with a colonializing occupation has lasted well into the 21st century. Any efforts by the international community, collectively or individually, to create a framework for supervising and ending the occupation that does not place these features at or near the core of their endeavors will almost certainly crash upon the shoals of Middle East realism. The long history of failed peace initiatives since the early 1970s, and particularly the Madrid-Oslo process that was launched in 1991, has been a lamentable testament to the international political preference for power over justice, for conflict management over conflict resolution, and for acquiescence over accountability. First, the international community has accepted that it bears a special responsibility for supervising the conflict and bringing it to a just conclusion. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, stated in his memoirs, "As I told the Security Council before I left office in 2006, he said, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not simply one unresolved problem among many. No other issue carries such a powerful, symbolic, and emotional charge affecting people far from the nations which voted
para que se lucha por una educación que no tenga uno para la cocina, uno para adelante y uno de leche. Va a estar hoy, no, ya no.
Cared for millions of Palestinian refugees for 7 and more decades. The regular issuance of the conflict has become, in many ways, the most international of international conflicts, and will certainly remain at or near the
casi 6 años de la desaparición forzada de nuestros compañeros de la delegación de Ayotzinapa.
Until a just and durable.
A ver, Alicia, mientras estoy compartiendo pantalla no puedo cerrar los micros. Entonces, a todas las personas que tienen el micro activado, por favor, que lo cierren. Vamos a continuar.
Near the top of the world's political agenda until a just and durable resolution can be found. Second, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is a highly unequal conflict. Militarily, Israel possesses the strongest armed forces in the region, with nuclear weapons, a highly successful military-industrial complex, state-of-the-art weaponry, and a deeply integrated armed forces relationship with the United States. The Palestinians, on the other hand, have lightly armed police and security forces in the West Bank and low-grade rockets in Gaza. Economically, Israel enjoys a European-level standard of living with a gross national income per capita level in 2018 of almost $41,000 American. That is 11 times higher than the Palestinian standard of around $3,700 in 2018 in US dollars. Diplomatically, Israel can count on the enduring support of the world's sole remaining superpower, as well as the more benign support of the European Union, all of which tends to count for far more in international relations than the large voting majorities, predominantly from the developing world, backing the Palestinians in the United Nations General Assembly. Territorially, Israel is the overwhelmingly dominant political power between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, with the Palestinians possessing only municipal-like authority within confined and fragmented patches of land. Demographically, the population of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in Israel and the Palestinian territory has reached a rough parity in 2020 of around 6.5 million persons each, which serves to highlight the stark differences in democratic rights and social power. Taken together, the consequences of this highly asymmetrical relationship has been a sophisticated regime of control shaped by subjugation, a coercive environment, and the absence of rights. Third, the international community has established a detailed framework for the administration and resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, anchored in international law, which enjoys broad acceptance. The source for this framework is found in the hundreds of resolutions adopted by the leading organs of the United Nations, the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council and its predecessor that have overseen the conflict. Accordingly, the prolonged Israeli occupation must fully end. Both the Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to live in peace and security and the right to self-determination, including sovereign, secure, and viable states within the boundaries of Mandate Palestine. The 250 Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are a flagrant violation under international law. East Jerusalem has been illegally annexed by Israel and remains occupied territory. The Palestinian refugees from the 1948-1967 wars have the right to choose to return to their homeland. Gaza is an integral part of Palestine. It remains occupied, and the Israeli blockade is a prohibited form of collective punishment. The importance of employing international law in conflict resolution involving two unequal parties is that it reduces the power imbalance between them and helps to ensure that the final resolution of any conflict is shaped by recognized rights and freedoms rather than by might, thereby offering the best chance for a sustainable peace. Fourth, Israel, with the frequent support of the United States, has been able to successfully insist since the start of the Madrid-Oslo peace process in 1991 that any negotiations with the Palestinians are to be conducted outside of the framework of applicable international law and the prevailing international consensus, notwithstanding the imperatives of the rules-based international order. This has enabled Israel to maintain an unyielding bargaining stance, with the end game of securing its claims to East Jerusalem and to most, if not all, of the West Bank settlements, while allowing a Potemkin statelet for the Palestinians with no meaningful space or sovereignty. The result has been a troubling paradox. While there is no conflict in the world where the United Nations has pronounced with such frequency and detail on the framework of international law for conflict resolution, this framework has rarely informed the various Oslo-related peace plans that have successively collapsed in the absence of any sturdy legal scaffolding to sustain a rights-based resolution. At its heart, this conflict is not a quarrel between intractable neighbors, a clash arising from ancient hatreds, or an irreconcilable struggle anchored in religion or ethnicity. It is rather a conflict over the denial of fundamental collective and individual rights, marked by the domination of one people over another, and its solution lies in the realization and protection of these fundamental human rights for both Palestinians and Israelis. Changing course and interpreting the agreements between Israel and Palestine and the international statements on the conflict through the fundamental requirements of our rules-based international order, as international law requires, would finally ensure that rights rather than realpolitik, govern the process to regulate and fully end the protracted occupation. Fifth, legal scholars, including many Israeli legal scholars, have pointed out that under international law, an occupation must be short-term and temporary. It must be strictly conducted in the best interests of the population under occupation. It must be returned in total to the sovereign, that is, the people under occupation, as soon as reasonably possible. And the occupying power acquires absolutely no right to annex any part of the occupied territory. Yet, the international legal framework on occupation has been increasingly unable to regulate, let alone effectively terminate, the momentous changes that Israel is generating on the ground. An occupying power that actively facilitates and encourages the settlement of 650,000 of its civilians in occupied territory, in clear and ongoing defiance of international law and international opinion, is engaged not only in annexation and with no other intention but to keep the occupied territory in perpetuity. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that he is only willing to give the Palestinians a state minus, while annexing significant parts of the West Bank and maintaining permanent security control over all the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. This has become an illegal occupation because it is no longer temporary. The occupying power is not administrating the occupation in good faith. It is acting in opposition to the directions of the international community and the strict requirements of international law, and has already annexed some of the territory with a well-declared intention to annex more. 6, the decisive missing factor throughout the 5-decade-long occupation and the longer conflict anchored in decisive events earlier in the 20th century has been the unwillingness of the international community to impose accountability. In my view, the 53-year-old Israeli occupation is endlessly sustainable unless and until the international community decides to end Israel's impunity and significantly increase the price on Israel for maintaining the occupation, and the Israeli public begins to see that the world is serious about imposing a meaningful cost to its continuation. To date, the Israeli leadership is more than content to live with the mild rebukes it receives from the international community regarding the protracted occupation because the economic and diplomatic price that it pays is so low. This is particularly so in comparison to the benefits it receives by continuing to absorb more and more of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and still maintaining a strong trade, investment, economic, and political ties with Europe, North America, and other major players in the international community. Under the Charter of the United Nations, every member of the UN agrees to, and I'm quoting, to accept and to carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Yet, in the face of the scores of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions reaffirming the principles of international law applicable to the occupation, Israel remains adamantly resistant to international direction. When encountering a defiant state, the international community has created for itself a substantial menu of legal tools to challenge such insubordination and bring the recalcitrant state back within the rules-based international order. These obligations are anchored in the international duties found in the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, governing occupations, and the international law on state responsibility. Israel has been shrewd in its assessment that the international community, particularly the United States, the European Union, and other members of the Western Alliance, lack the political will to insist that it comply with international obligations. As a result, Israel has rarely faced meaningful consequences for its truculent behavior. As the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy has recently written, and I'm quoting, "No country is as dependent on the support of the international community as Israel, yet Israel allows itself to defy the world as few dare," unquote. And seventh, Among the targets of the growing illiberalism in Israel and the deep divisions within Palestinian society are the civil society organizations who regularly raise uncomfortable truths about the profoundly corrosive impact that the protracted occupation has had on democratic rights, human rights, and the rule of law. Both Israel and Palestine have active human rights bodies which have produced leading-edge reports and conduct influential advocacy campaigns internationally on the bleak human rights record of the Israeli occupation, as well as increasingly on the pattern of human rights breaches by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Within Israeli society, organizations such as Al-Haq, Adamir, El-Mizan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, the Society of St. Ives, and the Jerusalem Legal Aid and Human Rights Center dispassionately depict the yawning gap between international legal standards and the systematic violations of human rights and humanitarian law committed by Israel in its conduct of the occupation. On the Israeli side, organizations such as B'Tselem, Gisha, Adel, Ish Din, Irmin, Breaking the Silence, Ahamok, and the Society for Human Rights in Israel do the same within their society. Together, these groups speak a common language grounded in the core documents of international human rights and humanitarian law, and they persist in their intrepid activism to investigate the regime of human rights violations that is integral to the occupation. Yet all of them are facing a shrinking space to criticize the disfigured state of human rights under occupation as they become the prime targets of those who are intolerant of their criticisms, yet alarmed by their effectiveness. So, having laid out the leading political and legal issues that dominate the conflict, let me now turn to the two issues that Dr. Ciccaro has asked me to speak to. The first issue that I want to address is Israel's threat to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. This arises from promises made to Israel by the Trump administration when it released its Peace to Prosperity plan in January 2020. When the plan was issued, with its blessing to allow Israel to annex around 30% of the West Bank, much of the world criticized it, with the European Union saying that the Trump plan broke with the internationally agreed parameters, unquote, while Pope Francis warned against the danger of inequitable solutions. In mid-June, I joined with 66 other UN human rights experts in a common statement denouncing Israel's plans for de facto and de jure annexation. This statement was widely quoted in news reports and civil society appeals around the world. Briefly stated, the statement made four central points. First, annexation is a fundamental violation of international law, starting with the 1945 Charter of the United Nations and including the 8 occasions between 1967 and 2016, when the UN Security Council stated that the acquisition of territory by force or war is inadmissible, all with specific reference to the Israeli occupation. The international community has prohibited annexation precisely because it incites wars, economic devastation, political instability, systematic human rights abuses, and widespread human suffering. It is now deemed to be a war crime under the Prohibition Against Aggression under the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. Second, what would be left of the West Bank following annexation would be a Palestinian Bantustan, islands of disconnected land and that are completely surrounded by Israel and with no territorial connection to the outside world. Israel has repeatedly promised in recent months that it plans to maintain permanent security control between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, regardless of any final agreement between Israel and Palestine. Thus, the morning after annexation, whenever it should occur, would be the crystallization of an already unjust reality. Two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. This is a vision of 21st century apartheid. Third, the already massive pattern of human rights violations associated with the occupation, which includes collective punishment, land confiscation, the imprisonment of children, administrative detention, the imposition of a two-tier system of unequal political, legal, social, cultural, and economic rights based on ethnicity and nationality, and the denial of Palestinian self-determination would almost certainly intensify and get worse in the aftermath of annexation. And fourth, the international community criticized Israel when it annexed East Jerusalem in 1980 and the Syrian Golan Heights in 1981. But it took no meaningful countermeasures on either occasion to oppose Israel's actions. We wouldn't be here in 2020 trying to prevent a further illegal annexation by Israel of Palestinian lands if tough steps had been taken by the international community 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago. This time must be different. Accountability and an end to impunity must be an immediate priority for the international community. In mid-August, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that he would temporarily postpone his annexation plans upon agreeing to establish diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates. Thus, de jure, or formal annexation, has been put to one side for the moment. But what is continuing uninterrupted on the ground is de facto annexation, the building of more illegal Israeli settlements and housing on occupied territory, the creation of more Israeli-only highways through the West Bank, the alienation of more Palestinian land in the West Bank for closed military zones, and the continued proclamation by leading Israeli political figures that formal annexation will come someday soon. In international law, de facto annexation of occupied territory is also illegal, regardless of whether the occupying power has issued a formal claim of sovereignty. Keep in mind that there is a startling disparity in the way that the international community reacted to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its approach to the two annexations undertaken by Israel 40 years ago and Israel's continued defiance today. Within weeks of the Russian invasion and annexation, and with the UN Security Council unable to act because of the Russian veto, many of the most powerful international players reacted swiftly and issued comprehensive sanctions against Russia. There is no meaningful difference in law or in politics between the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Israel's past and proposed annexations. It would be a body blow to international law if Israel's threats to annex more Palestinian land goes forward and the world is once again silent in terms of its failure to impose meaningful costs on Israel. The other issue that I wish to address to you today is the question of apartheid. This word has become more frequently used in recent years by many different commentators to describe an occupation that is turning into something more harsh and more virulent. The permanent alien rule of one people over another, encased in an entrenched two-tier system of unequal laws and political rights, segregated communities, separate networks of roads, and unequal access to property, social and employment rights based entirely on one's ethnicity and nationality. Indeed, apartheid is a term used by many Israelis themselves to describe the thickening occupation. Let me just cite two examples. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak said in 2010 that, and I'm quoting, "As long as this territory west of the Jordan River, there is only one political entity called Israel, there's either going to be non-Jewish or it's going to be non-democratic. If this block of millions of Palestinians cannot vote, that will be an apartheid state." And in 2013, the former Israeli ambassador to South Africa, Alon Lilel, said that, "I'm here today because I came to the conclusion that the occupation of the West Bank as it exists today is a sort of Israeli apartheid. The occupation," he said, became a hump on the back of Zionism. It is now a hump on the state of Israel. Apartheid is both a political term and a legal term. Politically, the term comes from the Afrikaner word for separateness, which was developed in South Africa to separate white South Africans from black, colored, and Indian South Africans, and to ensure white supremacy. It took an 80-year-old struggle to finally end apartheid in 1994, and to finally ensure the consolidation of democracy and the possibility of human rights for all. Legally, the United Nations adopted the Convention Against Apartheid in 1973, which defined apartheid as inhuman acts committed in the context of a regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups. In 2002, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court became part of international law. The statute lists apartheid as one of the prohibited crimes against humanity. In June 2020, the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din published an 85-page legal opinion by Michael Safard, an Israeli human rights lawyer, which concluded that the crime of apartheid was being committed by Israel in the West Bank. In summary, the Yesh Din document lists 8 leading examples of the denial of Palestinian rights and inhuman acts, which it concluded amounted to the existence of apartheid. These are the 8 examples. First, the creation of 250 Israeli settlements and 650,000 Israeli settlers in occupied territory, which is a war crime under the 2002 Rome Statute. Second, the denial of civil rights through the denial of the right to vote by Palestinians for the government that actually rules them and which denies them the right to self-determination. Third, the dual legal system, where a full panoply of political and civil rights flow to the 440,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, while the Palestinians live under a highly restrictive regime of military law. Fourth, the denial of development, where the Israeli settlers live in 250 prosperous Jewish-only settlements with industrial zones and favorable financial incentives, while the Palestinian economy is shrunken and depleted. Fifth, the policy of separation between Israelis and Palestinians, where significant parts of the West Bank are off limits to Palestinians. 6, land expropriation and dispossession, where the Palestinians suffer under extremely discriminatory land allocation policies, with more than 99% of public land allocations benefiting Israelis and less than 0.25% benefiting Palestinians. 7th, persecution of regime opponents and critics, where Israel imprisons several thousand Palestinian political prisoners with restrictions on political expression and protests in the West Bank. And 8th, forcible population transfer, where Israel controls the Palestinian population registry and where it has removed entire communities of Palestinians from their traditional lands to make way either for settlements or for closed military zones. If you're interested in exploring the debate over whether Israel's occupation has become an apartheid system in the West Bank, I'd urge you to look at the growing literature on this issue, including the comprehensive report by Yesh Din from June of this year. So in conclusion, let me emphasize this fundamental point. There has been no occupation in the modern world that has been conducted with the international community so alert to the many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupier's obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and establish permanent sovereignty, so well informed about the scale of suffering endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it. We have a global responsibility to address and challenge human rights violations wherever they may occur. Climate change, torture, extreme poverty, and the crushing of protests and free expression are all tragic patterns of human rights in jeopardy in the world today. The denial of basic rights in Palestine is also one of these injustices that the world has left unaddressed and unresolved for far too long. In this conflict, international law has become a weapon of power rather than a tool of justice. Let us all work hard to wind up changing this. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and I wish you well in your future careers.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos por estar escuchando la conferencia. Sin más, como ya he dicho, si queréis preguntar cualquier cosa, en el chat ya veo que hay bastantes comentarios. Si queréis que le traslademos alguna cuestión a Michael, por supuesto lo haremos encantados. Y emplazaros para la próxima reunión, conferencia que tendremos el miércoles que viene. Sin más, bueno, pues nos despedimos por hoy.